The airport terminal was buzzing with the usual chaotic energy that comes with a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The announcements over the loudspeaker were muffled by the sound of hundreds of people shuffling through the security lines, the sharp barking of TSA agents, and the overwhelming noise of travelers dragging heavy-wheeled bags across the polished floors. Near the entrance to the exclusive first-class lounge, the atmosphere shifted. It was quieter here, calmer, but there was a distinct tension in the air. A well-dressed businessman was pacing back and forth near the boarding gate. He was wearing a tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he was holding a phone to his ear with one hand while aggressively checking a gold watch on his wrist with the other. He was the kind of person who demanded attention without saying a word. His face was flushed, and he looked visibly annoyed that the plane wasn't boarding yet. "I don't care about the delay," he barked into the phone, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. "I paid for a seat that gets me there on time, not sitting on the tarmac while they figure out the weather." He hung up the call sharply, shoving the phone into his pocket and letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. A young woman standing nearby holding a coffee flinched at his sudden movement, offering him an apologetic smile, but he just rolled his eyes and looked away. A few minutes later, the gate agent finally picked up the microphone. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now ready to begin boarding for Flight 142 to Los Angeles. We would like to invite our first class and diamond members to step forward at this time." The businessman didn't wait for the sentence to finish. He grabbed his briefcase and a leather garment bag and marched to the front of the line. He cut off an elderly man who was struggling to lift his ticket from his pocket, pushing past him with a grunt of irritation. "Excuse me, coming through," he muttered, not making eye contact. He handed his boarding pass to the agent with a look that said he was doing her a favor by flying with them. As he walked down the jet bridge, his shoulders relaxed slightly. This was his domain. He walked into the first-class cabin and immediately began inspecting his surroundings. He located his seat, a plush window pod with plenty of legroom, and threw his bags onto the adjacent seat rather than stowing them. He sat down and immediately pressed the call button above his head. When a flight attendant appeared with a practiced smile, the businessman didn't return it. "Champagne," he said simply. "And make sure it's the good vintage, not the house stuff. Also, it's too warm in here. Can you do something about the temperature?" The flight attendant kept her professional composure, though her eyes tightened slightly. "Of course, sir. I will check with the captain about the temperature and bring your drink right away." While the businessman was busy making himself comfortable, the rest of the cabin began to fill up. Most of the passengers looked like him, expensive suits, talking loudly about stock options and real estate, tapping away on laptops. The cabin was filling with the sounds of important business deals and self-important chatter. Then, a quiet figure appeared at the entrance of the cabin. He didn't look like he belonged in first class. In fact, he didn't really look like he belonged in an airport at all. He was wearing a faded black hoodie that looked like it had seen better days, a pair of loose-fitting jeans that were slightly frayed at the cuffs, and a worn-out baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had a small, green backpack slung over one shoulder, looking like a student heading to class or a backpacker on a budget. He walked slowly down the aisle, keeping his head down. He didn't look at the other passengers, and he certainly didn't look at the businessman who was currently sipping his champagne. He found his seat in the middle row, right next to the businessman. The businessman watched him approach with a look of sheer horror. He looked the man up and down, taking in the casual clothes, the scruffy beard, and the messy hair peeking out from under the cap. He couldn't believe it. How did someone dressed like a street person end up in first class next to him? He assumed there must have been a mistake with the boarding, or perhaps some sort of operational upgrade that put the riffraff in the premium seats. The quiet man stood in the aisle for a moment, waiting for the businessman to move his briefcase and garment bag from the empty seat. The businessman didn't budge. He just stared at the man, his jaw tight, pretending he didn't notice him standing there. After a few seconds of awkward silence, the quiet man spoke softly. His voice was low and polite. "Excuse me, sir. Is that your bag? I think this is my seat." The businessman let out a loud, sarcastic huff. He slowly picked up his bag, acting as if it weighed a ton, and shoved it under the seat in front of him. "Be my guest," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "They're letting just about anyone up here these days, aren't they?" The quiet man didn't react. He just nodded his head slightly. "Thanks," he murmured. He lifted his backpack into the overhead bin with gentle care, being careful not to hit anyone, and then squeezed into his seat. He didn't take out a laptop or a phone. He didn't start shouting into a device. Instead, he pulled a small, worn paperback book out of his pocket, leaned back, and opened it. He crossed his legs, trying to make himself as small as possible so he wouldn't invade the businessman's space. The businessman couldn't settle down now. He was too agitated by the presence of this nobody next to him. He felt that his expensive experience was being ruined. He looked around to see if anyone else was noticing, but most people were distracted. He turned his body away from the quiet man, angling himself toward the window, and loudly flagged down the flight attendant again. "Can I get a pillow?" he asked, pointing a thumb over his shoulder. "And maybe some noise-canceling headphones. It seems the ambience isn't quite what I expected." He made sure to say it loudly enough for the quiet man to hear, intending to humiliate him. He wanted the stranger to know that he wasn't welcome, that he was lesser. The quiet man just turned a page in his book, completely ignoring the outburst, his face calm and expressionless. The businessman's frustration grew. He hated being ignored. He watched the quiet man out of the corner of his eye, looking for any reason to complain. He saw the man's sneakers, which were old and dirty. He saw the frayed cuff of his jeans. It made him angry. He felt like he had paid for luxury, and instead, he was trapped next to someone who looked like they belonged in a hostel. As the plane door closed and the safety demonstration began, the tension between the two passengers was thick. The businessman sat stiffly, his arms crossed, radiating annoyance. The quiet man sat relaxed, reading his book, completely unaware or perhaps just uncaring of the storm brewing beside him. The plane began to push back from the gate, and the businessman looked out the window, thinking that at least once they were in the air, he could sleep and forget about the insult of having to sit next to such a person. He had no idea that the nobody sitting next to him was one of the most famous and beloved actors in the world, and he certainly didn't know that his behavior was about to become a very public lesson in judgment. The roar of the plane's engines filled the cabin as the heavy aircraft lifted off the runway, pressing everyone back into their seats. The businessman gripped the armrests tightly, not out of fear, but out of habit, as if he needed to physically control his environment. As soon as the fasten seat belt sign dinged off, he unbuckled with a sharp click and immediately reached for the in-flight entertainment system, aggressively tapping the screen to select a movie. He was determined to ignore the passenger sitting next to him, but the universe seemed to have other plans. The man in the hoodie, whom the businessman had already labeled a nobody in his mind, shifted slightly in his seat. He wasn't trying to be difficult, he was just trying to get comfortable for the long flight ahead. He adjusted his legs, trying to find a spot where his knees wouldn't press against the hard plastic of the seat in front of him. In the cramped space of first class, even a small movement can ripple to the person sitting next to you. The businessman reacted instantly. He stopped tapping his screen and glared sideways. The passenger in the hoodie had crossed his legs, and his foot was perhaps an inch over the invisible line dividing their legroom. To the businessman, this was a declaration of war. Really, the businessman snapped, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation around him. The man in the hoodie looked up, startled. His eyes were wide and confused behind the rim of his baseball cap. "I'm sorry," he asked quietly. "You're encroaching on my space," the businessman said, pointing an accusing finger at the man's foot. "I paid a significant amount of money for this seat. That means I paid for the space around it, too. I didn't pay to have you sprawling all over me like it's a park bench." The man in the hoodie quickly uncrossed his legs and tucked his feet back under his own seat. "My apologies," he said softly. "I didn't realize." He went back to reading his book, clearly hoping the matter was settled. But the businessman's blood was up now. He was bored, agitated, and looking for a target. The quiet apology only annoyed him more. He didn't want politeness, he wanted submission. He wanted to feel superior. He huffed loudly, throwing his hands up in the air to catch the attention of the flight attendants. When none came immediately, he turned his body fully toward his neighbor, invading his personal space to deliver his lecture. "You know, this is exactly what is wrong with travel today," the businessman began, his voice loud enough for the people in the row behind to hear. "People like you get a lucky break, maybe a miles upgrade or some corporate perk, and suddenly you think you own the place. But you don't know how to act." The man in the hoodie turned a page in his book, seemingly trying to tune out the noise. "I'm talking to you," the businessman barked. "Don't be rude." The man sighed softly, closed his book for a second, and looked over. "I'm just trying to read, sir. Please, let us just have a peaceful flight." The businessman let out a cruel, short laugh. "Peaceful? You don't get to decide what's peaceful here. Look at how you're dressed. You look like you just rolled out of bed. It's disrespectful to everyone else here who made an effort. It's disrespectful to the airline." He gestured at the man's worn-out hoodie. "Did you get that at a thrift store, or is that just your look?" he sneered, emphasizing the word look as if it were a dirty joke. "You look like a mess. Honestly, they should have a dress code for this cabin so people like you don't lower the tone." The man in the hoodie didn't take the bait. He didn't shout back. He didn't insult the businessman's suit or his arrogance. He just looked at him with a calm, almost pitying expression. "It's just clothes," he said, his voice steady. "They're comfortable for flying." "Comfortable?" the businessman was nearly shouting now. "This isn't your living room. It is a premium travel experience. It's for professionals. Not for—" He waved his hand dismissively at the man, struggling to find the right insulting word. "Not for people who look like they're homeless." A woman in the row across the aisle turned around, her face wrinkled in disgust. She looked at the businessman, not the man in the hoodie. "Sir, could you keep your voice down?" she asked. "Some of us are trying to relax." The businessman whipped his head toward her. "Stay out of this. This is a private conversation." He turned back to his neighbor, angrier than ever that he was losing the room. "See, even they think you're the problem. Just sitting there with your mouth shut, acting like you're better than everyone because you're cool and mysterious. I know your type. You think you're too good for conversation. You think you're some kind of artist or musician, right? Too cool to wear a suit. The man in the hoodie rubbed his face, looking tired. He just wanted to be left alone. I really don't want any trouble, he said. I just want to get to Los Angeles. And I want to enjoy my flight without sitting next to a bum, the businessman shot back. The insult hung in the air. It was harsh and unnecessary. The cabin around them had gone quiet. The flight attendants at the front galley were watching the interaction closely, whispering to each other. They knew who the man in the hoodie was, of course. They had seen his passport. They knew he was one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. But they were trained professionals, and they couldn't just intervene unless there was a physical threat. So they watched, ready to step in if the businessman went too far. The businessman, feeling empowered by the silence, decided to escalate further. He felt the man in the hoodie was too calm. That calmness was an insult to his anger. You know what the businessman said, leaning in close. I should report you. I should complain to the captain that I feel unsafe sitting next to someone who is clearly unstable. You don't speak, you don't make eye contact, you dress like a wreck. Who knows what you're going to do when the lights go out? He laughed at his own joke, a dry, humorless sound. Maybe you're a criminal. Are you running from the law? Is that why you're hiding under that hood? The man in the hoodie finally snapped his book shut. He placed it on his lap and turned fully toward the businessman. For the first time, his expression changed from neutral to something harder. He didn't look angry, just firm. I am not hiding, the man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the businessman pause. And I am not a criminal. I am just a human being sitting on a plane. Just like you. The businessman opened his mouth to retort, to throw another insult, but he was momentarily stopped by the intense gaze of the man next to him. There was something familiar in those eyes, something that made a tiny alarm bell go off in the back of the businessman's mind, but he pushed it away. He was too committed to his cruelty now to back down. Don't get philosophical with me, the businessman scoffed, waving his hand again. Save the human being speech for someone who cares. I know exactly what you are, you're a loser who got lucky with a seat assignment. And I intend to make sure the crew knows just how unhappy I am about it. He reached up and slammed his call button again, holding it down for 5 seconds. Let's see how they like dealing with a disturbance in first class. He leaned back, a smug, satisfied smirk on his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had asserted his dominance. He had no idea that by drawing the attention of the crew, he was about to set the stage for his own complete and total humiliation. The man in the hoodie just leaned back, closed his eyes, and waited for the inevitable. He knew who he was. He knew that the businessman's anger was about to be swallowed up by a very harsh reality. The flight attendant arrived at the aisle with a sense of urgency, her footsteps quick and purposeful against the soft carpet. She had seen the flashing call light from the galley and watched the aggressive way the businessman had been waving his hand. Her face was set in a professional mask, but her eyes were tight with concern. She had seen difficult passengers before, but this man had an energy about him that felt volatile. Sir, you pressed the call button, she said, keeping her voice level and soothing. She positioned herself between the businessman and the aisle, creating a subtle barrier. Is everything all right? Can I get you something? The businessman didn't even look at her face. He pointed an accusatory finger at the man sitting quietly next to him, who was now looking out the window, seemingly lost in the clouds below. No, everything is not all right, he snapped. I want to be moved. Now. The flight attendant glanced at the quiet man in the hoodie, then back to the businessman. "I understand you are upset, sir. Unfortunately, the cabin is completely full today. Every seat is occupied. I can check if there are any available seats in economy, but first class is sold out." The businessman scoffed so loudly that a passenger in the row ahead turned his head. "Economy? I paid for first class. Why should I be punished because this person," he gestured again to his neighbor, "can't behave properly? He's intimidating me. He's encroaching on my space. He's muttering things under his breath." The man in the hoodie turned back from the window. He looked genuinely confused. "I haven't said a word, sir," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine hum. "I was just looking at the view." "Liar!" the businessman barked. "You were muttering. You're trying to provoke me. I know your type. You get off on making people uncomfortable." The flight attendant raised her hand slightly, trying to calm the situation. "Sir, please. We need to maintain a calm environment for all our guests. I can offer you some noise-canceling headphones. Or perhaps a glass of wine to help you relax." "I don't want wine. I want him gone." The businessman's face was turning a deep shade of red. He was sweating now, despite the cool air conditioning. He felt like he was losing control of the situation, and that was his worst nightmare. Look at him. He's sitting there pretending to be a victim, but he's the aggressor. It's passive-aggressive, and I want to stand for it. The quiet man looked at the flight attendant. He saw the stress in her eyes, the way she was holding herself tense to manage this angry customer. He didn't want to make her job harder. He reached out and gently touched her arm. "It's okay," he said to her softly. "I don't want to cause any trouble. If he wants to move, maybe we can see if someone in the back wants to upgrade. I'm happy to give up my seat." The businessman heard this and let out a cruel laugh. "Oh, look at that. Playing the hero now. I'll give up my seat. Spare me. You just want the attention." The flight attendant looked at the quiet man with a profound sense of gratitude. She knew who he was, and she knew that he had every right to tell this man to get lost. Instead, he was offering to move to the back of the plane to save her the headache. She forced a tight smile. "Thank you, sir, that is very kind. But we cannot ask you to move. You have a right to your seat." She turned back to the businessman. "Sir, I suggest we all take a deep breath. I am going to bring you a complimentary meal from the business menu. Let's just try to reset, shall we?" Before the businessman could answer, she turned and walked quickly back to the galley. She needed to get the senior purser. This was getting out of hand. Left alone, the businessman turned his full attention back to the quiet man. The fact that the flight attendant had taken the other man's side only made him more irrational. He felt humiliated. He felt like the world was ganging up on him. "You think you're so smart," he hissed, leaning in close so that his spit landed on the armrest between them. "You think you won that little exchange? You didn't. You just showed everyone what a passive coward you are." The man in the hoodie sighed, a sound of deep exhaustion. He picked up his paperback book again, but the businessman slapped it down before he could open it. The slap wasn't hard enough to hurt, but it was shocking. It was a violation. "Don't ignore me when I'm talking to you," the businessman shouted. People 3 rows ahead were now turning around. The mood in the cabin was shifting from curiosity to hostility toward the businessman. He was making a scene, and nobody likes a scene on an airplane. "I'm listening," the quiet man said, his voice dropping an octave. It wasn't a fearful whisper anymore, it was a warning. I am listening to every word you say. And I am asking you to stop. The businessman was too far gone to hear the warning. He was fueled by a cocktail of entitlement and travel fatigue. He looked the man up and down, sneering at the simple clothes, the worn shoes, the lack of expensive jewelry. He felt a surge of superiority, a feeling that he was better than this person, that his life mattered more. Look at you, the businessman said, his voice dripping with venom. You're pathetic. Sitting here in a hoodie, reading a paper book like it's the 1950s. You have no idea how the world works, do you? You're just a nobody. A loser trying to look cool by acting mysterious. He leaned back, crossing his arms, a satisfied smirk on his face. He thought he had finally delivered the ultimate insult. He thought he had cut deep. You probably don't even have a job, the businessman continued, hammering the point home. Probably living off your parents, or maybe you're some struggling artist waiting for a big break that's never going to come. Let me tell you something, in the real world, people like me run things. People like you are just background noise. You're just filler. The quiet man sat motionless. He didn't open his book. He didn't look out the window. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes focused on the seat back in front of him. The silence stretched out between them, heavy and thick. The businessman mistook the silence for defeat. He laughed again, a self-satisfied sound. Nothing to say, no big speech, I thought so. You know I'm right. That's why you're quiet. Because you know you're a fraud. He picked up his phone, triumphant. He felt like he had won the argument. He had put the stranger in his place. He had established his dominance. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting across the aisle was filming him on her phone, and that the man next to him was clenching his jaw so hard it looked painful. I'm going to take a nap, the businessman announced loudly, putting his seat back as far as it would go. Don't wake me up. And try not to steal anything while I'm asleep. He closed his eyes, a smug smile playing on his lips, thinking he was the king of the cabin. The man in the hoodie sat still as a statue, the businessman's cruel words hanging in the recycled air of the plane. The calm before the storm was over. The businessman had no idea that he had just insulted one of the most famous and wealthy actors on the planet, a man who had likely earned more in the last week than the businessman would see in a decade. He had no idea that his victory was about to become a very public, very embarrassing defeat. The silence that followed the businessman's cruel outburst was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was the kind that makes your ears ring because everyone nearby is holding their breath. The businessman had his eyes closed, a smug grin on his face, convinced he had just schooled a stranger on how the world works. He believed he was the king of this metal tube at 30,000 feet. Next to him, the quiet man sat perfectly still. He hadn't opened his book again. He hadn't looked out the window. He was just sitting there, his hands resting on his knees, staring straight ahead. If he was hurt, he didn't show it. If he was angry, he hid it well. He just looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much in his life to be bothered by the opinion of one loud, arrogant stranger in a suit. A few minutes passed. The businessman shifted in his seat, expecting a drink or a snack to arrive. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, impatient. Why was the service so slow? He opened one eye to see if the flight attendant was coming. He saw the head purser walking down the aisle. This wasn't just any attendant, it was the woman in charge of the entire cabin. She was walking with purpose, holding a silver tray in one hand and a bottle of champagne in the other. But she wasn't looking at the businessman. She was walking straight toward the quiet man. The businessman watched, confused. He cleared his throat loudly, assuming she was just passing by and would stop to apologize for the delay once she served the important passenger. But she didn't stop. She stopped right at the quiet man's row. She didn't lean in and whisper. She spoke clearly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Her voice was warm, filled with the kind of genuine respect that the businessman hadn't received from anyone all day. "Mr. Reeves," she asked softly. The businessman's eyes snapped open. He sat up straighter. Reeves, the name tickled a memory in the back of his mind, but he couldn't quite place it. He watched as the quiet man turned his head. The man reached up and slowly took off his baseball cap, running a hand through his dark, messy hair. The transformation was subtle, but suddenly, the face was familiar to everyone except the businessman. The quiet man looked up at the purser and gave a small, shy smile. "Yes, how can I help you?" The purser beamed at him. "We are so honored to have you flying with us again," she said, her voice vibrating with excitement. "I just wanted to come by personally. The captain is a huge fan. He sent this up for you." She held out the silver tray. On it sat a glass of champagne and a small box of expensive chocolates. "It's the 2010 vintage. He remembers it's your favorite." The businessman froze. His heart skipped a beat. He looked at the man sitting next to him, the man in the faded hoodie and the worn-out jeans. The man he had called a bum, a loser, a fraud. The man he had accused of being unemployed and homeless. The quiet man, Keanu Reeves, reached out and took the glass. "That is incredibly kind," he said, his voice humble. "Please thank the captain for me. And thank you for bringing this. You really didn't have to go to the trouble." "It is absolutely no trouble at all," the purser gushed. "Also, once we reach cruising altitude, if you'd like to stretch your legs, the cockpit is always open to you. We'd love to have you say hello to the crew." Keanu nodded politely. "I might just do that. Thank you." The purser lingered for a moment, just to be in his orbit, before moving on to check on other passengers. As she walked away, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. The businessman sat rigid in his seat. His face had gone from a flushed red to a pale, ghostly white. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. This wasn't just some random guy. This wasn't a struggling artist or a homeless person off the street. This was Keanu Reeves, the star of The Matrix, John Wick, one of the most famous actors on the planet. A man worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He looked at Keanu again, really looked at him this time. He saw the same face he had seen on movie posters and billboards for decades. But he didn't see a movie star right now. He saw a man who had just listened to 10 minutes of insults without fighting back. He saw a man who had offered to move seats to avoid a scene. He saw a man who was currently sipping champagne with more grace than the businessman had shown in his entire life. The businessman's stomach churned. He felt sick. He looked around the cabin. The other passengers were staring at him. The woman across the aisle was glaring at him with open disgust. The teenager 2 rows up had her phone out, recording him. He realized that he hadn't just been rude to a stranger, he had publicly humiliated himself by bullying one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood. Keanu, seemingly unaware of the businessman's internal panic, turned his head slightly. He didn't look angry. He didn't look vindicated. He just looked at the businessman with those sad, puppy dog eyes that had made him famous. The businessman stammered. His voice cracked. I didn't realize. Keanu held up a hand to stop him. He didn't want an apology born out of embarrassment. He didn't want the groveling that was about to start. He just wanted peace. It's okay, Keanu said softly. He turned his body slightly away, creating a boundary, but not a hostile one. It's been a long day for everyone. Let's just enjoy the flight. He picked up his book again, but he didn't read it. He just held it, looking out the window at the clouds passing by. The businessman shrank back into his seat. He pulled his expensive suit jacket tight around him, as if trying to disappear. He didn't press the call button again. He didn't ask for a drink. He didn't dare complain about the temperature or the legroom. He sat there, staring straight ahead, wishing the floor of the plane would just open up and swallow him whole. Every few seconds, he would sneak a glance at the man next to him. Keanu was just sitting there, quietly sipping his champagne, looking out at the world. He hadn't used his fame to fight back. He hadn't yelled, "Do you know who I am?" He had just taken the insults, treated the flight crew with kindness, and accepted the captain's gift with humility. The businessman realized then that Keanu Reeves had more class in his little finger than the businessman had in his entire body. He had judged a book by its cover, and he had been completely, utterly wrong. And now, trapped in a metal tube miles above the earth, he had to sit next to his mistake for the next 4 hours. The flight attendant walked by a little later, collecting trash. When she came to the businessman, she didn't smile. She didn't offer him anything. She just took his empty water glass with cold efficiency and walked away. The businessman felt the walls closing in. He was no longer the king of the cabin. He was a pariah. And all because he couldn't just be nice to the quiet man in the hoodie. The rest of the flight felt like the longest journey of the businessman's life. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer peaceful, it was suffocating. He sat stiff in his expensive leather seat, his body rigid, barely daring to breathe too loudly. Every few minutes, he would sneak a nervous glance at the man sitting next to him. Keanu Reeves, the man he had verbally destroyed just 20 minutes ago, was now completely at ease. He had his legs stretched out, comfortably crossing his ankles. He was watching a comedy on the small screen in front of him, chuckling softly at the jokes. He looked entirely unbothered, as if the earlier incident had never happened. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He just existed, radiating a calm energy that made the businessman feel even smaller. The businessman tried to lose himself in his work. He opened his laptop, but the words on the screen blurred together. He couldn't focus. All he could think about was the video that might be circulating, or the stories the other passengers would tell when they landed. He had built a reputation on being powerful and dominant, but in the span of one conversation, he had revealed himself to be a bully. About an hour before landing, the flight attendant returned. She came with a warm towel for Keanu and a fresh bottle of water. She didn't even look at the businessman as she placed the towel on a tray for Keanu. It was a silent dismissal, and it stung more than any insult could. "Thank you," Keanu said, his voice warm. "You're very welcome, Mr. Reeves," she replied with a smile. "Is there anything else we can get you before we begin our descent?" "Actually," Keanu said softly. He glanced at the businessman, who was pretending to be deeply engrossed in an email. "Could I maybe get an extra sandwich? My neighbor here hasn't eaten anything, and I think he might be hungry." The businessman froze. His fingers hovered over his keyboard. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. After being yelled at, insulted, and berated, Keanu was offering him food. The businessman's face burned with a mix of shame and shock. The flight attendant looked at Keanu with pure admiration, then turned a cool gaze to the businessman. "Of course. I will bring one right away." When she returned, she placed a sandwich on the businessman's tray table without a word. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She just walked away. The businessman looked at the sandwich, then at Keanu. Keanu was looking straight ahead, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He hadn't done it to embarrass the businessman further, he had just done it because he was a decent human being. It was the ultimate power move, kindness in the face of cruelty. The businessman stammered, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. "You didn't have to do that." Keanu turned his head. His eyes were kind, not judgmental. "It's a long flight, man. Everyone gets hungry. No big deal." "I'm sorry," the businessman blurted out. The words rushed out of him, tumbling over one another. "I am so sorry. I didn't know who you were. I was out of line. I was terrible." Keanu waved his hand gently, brushing off the apology. "Hey, don't worry about it. We all have bad days. We all say things we don't mean when we're stressed. It's forgotten. But I called you." The businessman couldn't even finish the sentence. "I treated you like you were nothing. And you're you." "It doesn't matter who I am," Keanu said, his voice dropping so only the two of them could hear. "You treat the guy in the hoodie the same way you treat the guy in the suit. That's the only thing that matters. It's just a seat, right? We're all just going to the same place." He reached out and patted the businessman on the shoulder. A solid, friendly pat. "Eat your sandwich. It's actually pretty good." The businessman sat back, tears stinging the corners of his eyes. He felt like he had been punched in the chest, but in a way that knocked the wind out of his ego and left him gasping for air. He took a bite of the sandwich. It tasted like humility. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, the usual scramble began. The ding of the seat belt sign sparked the collective anxiety of the cabin. Everyone grabbed their bags, standing up in the aisle to wait for the door to open. Usually, the businessman would be the first one up, pushing his way to the front, demanding speed. Today, he sat still. He waited for Keanu to stand first. Keanu took his time. He stood up, grabbed his worn green backpack, and placed his baseball cap back on his head. He didn't act like a movie star rushing to a VIP lounge. He acted like a normal guy waiting for his turn. As Keanu stepped into the aisle to leave, the businessman stood up behind him. The tension in the air was thick. Other passengers were looking at them, whispering. They had all seen the interaction. They had all seen the businessman be humbled. Keanu stopped. He turned around and looked at the businessman. "Have a good trip, man. Safe travels." "You too," the businessman whispered. "Thank you." Keanu nodded and walked up the jet bridge. As he entered the terminal, the businessman saw a few people do double takes. Passengers in the airport recognized him immediately. A few stopped to ask for a selfie. Keanu smiled, put down his bag, and took the photos. He chatted with them like they were old friends. He was generous with his time, radiating that same genuine warmth he had shown on the plane. The businessman stood in the doorway of the plane for a moment, watching. The flight attendant walked past him, pausing for a second. She didn't smile, but she didn't look angry anymore either. She just looked tired. "Have a nice day, sir," she said, her voice neutral. "You too," the businessman replied. And this time, he actually meant it. He walked through the terminal, dragging his expensive leather bag behind him. He saw a few people pointing at him, likely recognizing him as the guy from the plane. But he didn't hold his head high. He kept his eyes on the floor, thinking about the sandwich he had just eaten and the simple lesson he had learned. He realized that his suit didn't make him a man. His money didn't make him important. And the guy in the hoodie, the guy he had insulted without a second thought, had more class, more dignity, and more wealth than he could ever hope to possess. It was a hard pill to swallow, but as he walked out of the airport and into the California sunshine, he knew he would never look at a quiet stranger in a hoodie the same way again.